I learned about ecological dynamics while I was at university, and it took me a while to understand it, and I know this is going to sound icky, it actually changed my life. Being hard of hearing on my right side, school, sport, and any social interaction really is challenging to communicate with people sometimes, even with people that know I'm hard of hearing. I have to sit on the right side of rooms so I can see and lip read what's going on, because if I was to sit on the left, I'd be staring at the person to the right of me so I can hear, which obviously is awkward and was awkward at school. Now, when I'm outside, obviously I want to shield my eyes from the sun so I can lip read because I can't rely on my hearing, so when teachers were standing there, obviously they don't want to face the sun, so they have the sun behind them. I can't see, so I'm like looking at them to try and understand what's going on, because obviously I can't hear, and obviously I stick out, which I didn't like as I was younger, mainly because I was always sticking out. I was poking my head around people's heads so I could lip read, or peeking over the top, so I was always like looking and being the odd one out, and it wasn't unnoticed. I got a lot of odd looks from me looking around, looking through things, looking over things, or just looking at people while I'm trying to listen to something else. It's just, I had to get used to it. But then similar in group conversations, when multiple people are talking or there's lots of things going on, it's very hard to pay attention to whoever's talking because I can't echolocate where people are talking from. I have to look and scan everyone's mouths to see who's talking and what's being said. So if I'm looking at someone and I hear something else, it takes a lot of effort. Putting all that with the many, oh, don't worry about it comments where they've said something but I haven't heard them and I've asked them what they've said and they said, oh, don't worry about it. That, for someone hard of hearing, is so annoying to hear because I don't know. I can't make that choice. I can't hear. Then combining that with the people that were the laughing or the joking because they were testing to see if I could hear or not. They'd shout insults or they'll whisper things in the side of my ear and I'm like, what is that? And they're just laughing and joking, but that happening constantly is just, it's not a fun experience. And when I was younger, all of that got to me. I was not a confident person by any means. I was the half-deaf kid, alongside many other labels and things, but I just kept to myself. No social media, minimal communication. I didn't go to any parties or anything because obviously communicating in loads of loud noises is just not easy. So for me, sports was my main get-out. But there was still issues. The coaches shouting at me from the sideline or asking me to do something, I don't always hear them. So they say, oh, you're not listening, you're not paying attention enough. It's like, I can't hear. And it's a similar sort of thing with teammates. Teammates would say something or whisper something or shout something and either I can't hear because it's outside and it's just like a load of noise, or I haven't been able to isolate their voice from all the other shouting that's going on, and I get blamed for making the mistake, either from the coaches, from the teammates, players, parents, whoever it is, I get blamed. Now yes, sometimes it was my fault, but a lot of the time when they say something to me afterwards, I'm like, when did you say that? I don't remember you saying that because I just didn't hear them most of the time. But my childhood, like everyone's, had challenges. My challenges, probably a little bit different from yours, but they were challenges nonetheless. And when I went to university, I just hit a massive low. I was confident in two things. I was confident in academics and I was confident in sports. Now, I wasn't top of the class by any means. I was just a solid B student. I was in top set or second set for most subjects, and I just got B's across the board, a couple of A's, a couple of C's, but a solid okay, good student. So failure, defined by a D grade or below in GCSEs, wasn't something I was used to. Then I go to university and now there's no exams and they're asking me to write a lot, something I am bad at. They're also asking me to read a lot, something I really don't like because I'm also bad at it. Or at least at the time joining university, and then you're also sort of expected to socialise and go out with others, go partying. Alcohol plus dark room, flashing lights with loud noise with a person that's hard of hearing, it's not a fun experience. I tried it, I hated it. Communicating with people that that you can't read their lips if they're drunk. You can't even see half their face because of the light. It's not a fun experience. And doing a sports coaching degree, I was thinking, right, I'm going to have a life in sport because sport is where I can stay, it's what I can do. But no matter where I went, I was told by other coaches, you're doing it wrong. That's not right. You shouldn't be doing it this way. I don't know what they're teaching you at university, but it's a load of rubbish. You're wasting your time at university, all these sorts of things. So the only two things I was confident in going into university, I was shot down. Now, the day of my A-level exams, the year before going into university, I lost 3 members of my family within 48 hours, and that was not a fun experience, but that was the first and really only time I'd experienced failure, struggle, pain in any significant way, and I hadn't really worked through any of that loss, struggle, trauma, pain, whatever word you want to put on there. So when I go to university and now all of my confidence is being shot, I really, really struggled with mental health. I didn't have a social life, my sports coaching was failing, and my academics was failing. But I remember this one specific lecture right after one of my semi-regular hospital visits at this point, and we were in a room next to the sports hall. I was sitting 2 tables back, on the right side of course, and I was listening to my head of course, and it was the favourite lecturer at the time, and he was doing what he normally did, which wasn't what the university board wanted. The board wanted, obviously, them to give us a degree and pass us and get good satisfaction scores, and my head of course was much more interested in sharing ideas and challenging our ideas about how we learn, how we experience the world, and how we can coach other people to be obviously more effective at whatever sport it was. It was a sports coaching degree after all. And he pointed to the table in front of me and said, "What is that?" and asked everyone, and all of us looking around like, well, what do you mean? It's a table. And after a couple of seconds I said, well, it's a table. He said, yeah, but what else is it? I'm like, what are you talking about? What else is it? It's a table. What do you mean? I remember being so confused, I didn't know what he wanted me to say, and that was exactly the point. Like, I was looking for the answer that he wanted me to say, not sharing all the possibilities. So when he started listing off, it's like, oh, it could be a fort, it could be a house, it could be a chair, or something you step on. He just started listing off all these different things, and as he was doing that, I'm sitting there thinking, well, yeah, it could be, but it's a table. And that's where he said, well, these are affordances of the object. And I was like, what? Affordances is something I'll get to later on in this video, but that was the first lecture where I was introduced to the concepts of ecological dynamics. All these ideas he'd been talking about in the first year, because at this point I'm actually at the beginning of my second year in the undergrad, all these ideas were related to ecological dynamics, but I hadn't really grasped that they're all interconnected. After that, I reassessed all the ideas that he'd been talking to us about and exposing us to, and I became more and more competent, one, as a coach, so I became more confident and competent at coaching other individuals effectively in trampoline, handball, football, and any other activity that I was coaching in for sport, but also more competent in being able to coach myself as a reflective practitioner, self-coach, whatever you want to call it. And developing my expertise in ecological dynamics helped me with all of, and I mean all of, my mental health issues. And I had been to countless therapists by this point, well into the 30s, and they said, oh, you're likely ADHD, ASD, and I was tested, and I'm mildly dyslexic, and they said, oh, you should probably go to the hospital to get an official diagnosis. And I was like, no, I'm already half deaf, I don't need another label to label me as disabled or needs or whatever, I just don't want that. So when I realised that ecological dynamics, these ideas were helping me through all of these issues that I've been struggling with for 5-6 years by this point, it felt good. Now, since graduating my MSc in Strength and Conditioning, I decided I wanted to work with other people, and before seeing ecological dynamics, I wouldn't even get on a Zoom call. I'd be far too scared. Like, that's not happening. No video call, no nothing. I'm staying in my box. But having graduated and applied ecological dynamics to myself and the way that I view the world and experience the world, I actually started working with people like Ali Abdul, big YouTube creator, James Janney, big YouTube creator, and I was traveling to London to talk to these people in person. Like, never thought that would even be possible. And to somewhat top it off, at the beginning of COVID, I woke up one day, and I'm not joking, I woke up and I couldn't see out of my right eye. It was like when you cry and you've got like tears in your eye and it's really blurry and you just see splodges. It was like that. But the more I wiped my eye, nothing changed. I just could not see. It was just, there's dark, there's some light splodges, and that's it. Long story short, I've had multiple surgeries on my eye, and I'm now on lifelong medication, which is currently all over the desk, so I'm partially sighted and hard of hearing. I'm not saying ecological dynamics is the solution, the step-by-step guide of how to solve your problems. No, but without the ideas, the shift in language, the change in explaining my experiences of learning, I don't think I would be here making this video. But here's the crux of it. Ecological dynamics relies on ecological psychology, which is radically different from the majority of psychology you and me are likely exposed to, which is cognitive psychology. For the rest of this video, I want to go deep into ecological psychology, dynamical systems theory, and bringing it back to ecological dynamics as a reference video for futures. So there is a lot of jargon, context, and stuff that's going to be in this video. Now, Hank Green did a psychology course, and it's on YouTube, it's a crash course in psychology, and he covers a lot of psychology, but he doesn't cover the entire approach of ecological psychology in the course. And I think it's because it's built from cognitive psychology, much like all of the other mainstream psychology courses that you would take at school, at university, or whatever. The ideas are all built from assumptions mainly built from the mechanics that we've learned about biological mechanisms. Now, ecological psychology challenges the base assumptions of cognitive psychology, and now I've spoken to Julia and Jeff. They are the authors of a book called Introduction to Ecological Psychology. It is an academic textbook. You can get it if you want. There's a link in the description, but I've built the rest of this video of the complex stuff from their book, so you can follow it chapter by chapter. There are bits missed out, of course, because I don't want this to be a 7-hour course. And I'm going to use some quotes from the book, like this one. We group every perspective that is not ecological into one category, which we label for convenience the traditional approach. And most psychology courses, conversations, and people that use psychology in day-to-day conversation are normally following those traditional assumptions. Yes, there are lots of variations in these assumptions, but all of the ones that are labeled as traditional in this sense lead to what we call unsolvable mysteries. And this all starts with the nature of knowledge. How do I know I'm seeing my screen? I mean, it's there, but I believe it's there because I trust my senses. But what if I can't trust my senses? The existence of my screen is now in doubt because the source of my knowledge is now in doubt. Descartes in 1637 considered this. Not the screen bit, because obviously screens weren't invented yet, but the existence of objects. And this is where the reasoning of the saying cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, sort of comes from. Not saying that the thinking made him exist, but that the doubt must have come from somewhere. Since then, learning about the senses and the nervous system is great, but we're still at the same point. Knowledge of the world comes from or through our nervous system. However, the notion that only my mind exists and the rest of the world is a trick being played on my senses is called solipsism. So we either believe the world exists, realism, or not, solipsism. Both possible, but there's no logical way to work out which one's right. However, if we're going to do any sort of science, we need to pick one, so we need to make an assumption. Sometimes we accept an assumption because the evidence cannot be had, and sometimes because we have been explicitly or implicitly operating under that assumption for so long. All science makes assumptions, so we need to assume either realism or solipsism, and I think realism makes the most sense. Hank, in his course, and basically all psychologists will assume realism because otherwise you can't really do science. So where does the knowledge come from assuming realism? Scientists have long followed empiricists such as Locke and Aristotle, where we learn from our experiences. So empiricist believes knowledge comes from experience, but there are two main principles. First, we begin with no knowledge. Locke, 1960, called this the tabula rasa, or blank slate. Second, knowledge can only be gained from the senses because experience is entirely sensory. And that is the second assumption of traditional approaches. But if we gain knowledge through our experiences, our senses, it doesn't answer Descartes' problem. How do we know we can trust our senses? How do we know our understanding of the world inside of our heads is the same as the world around us? This leads to assumption 3. Our senses somehow inform us about the world. The somehow is what all of the science is looking at. The science makes hypotheses and then tries to find causes. We then accept or reject the causes based on the results. The traditional approaches, and most of modern science, assume local causality. Local causality suggests that in order for thing A to be the cause of thing B, A must be in direct contact with B. The fourth assumption, local causality. But if you're like me, you immediately see an issue with that. I'm not touching my screen, so I'm not in direct contact with my screen. Me moving my mouse caused the mouse to move on my screen, and my screen arguably caused the action of me moving the mouse. This is the action at a distance problem. There's a distance between the action. Maybe the contact is mediated. There is indirect contact. The fifth assumption. There is something in between me and my screen that causes my actions. There are a handful of options here, but they all boil down to the same idea. There is a copy of the world. So my screen gets copied somehow, and that copy is in direct contact with me. That copy then informs my actions on the mouse. But how does the copy get into my head? Well, light travels in straight lines, and we have light-sensitive cells in the back of our eyes. So we now have a retinal image, but the retinal image is upside down, 2D, and back to front. I have the copy in my head, but it doesn't represent my experience of the world. I don't see left on the right, right on the left, or in 2D. I see in 3D. Leading to assumption 6. The copy delivered to the brain is bad and needs to be fixed. Just to stress the importance of needing to fix the retinal image, think about depth. If the stimulation, the retinal image, is 2D, how do I know what's in front or behind something? What about when objects start or stop? Color contrast isn't enough. Helmholtz suggested that the flat retinal image was not completely meaningless. It provided data, imperfect data, but data nonetheless. So we could then infer form from patterns called cues. Looking out my window, I can see there is a house further away because it's higher up my field of view. Or when I look out at sea, I know that the boat that is closer to the horizon higher up my field of view is further away. Helmholtz suggested we are not consciously aware of this interpretation. But that means I'm not aware or really have any control of these interpretations. Cue plus rule plus unconscious inference equals understanding. However, what if a stimulation created a retinal image that's very, very similar? Helmholtz argued that the inference was aided by an understanding of the most likely situation, which is the principle of maximum likelihood. Unconscious inference and the principle of maximum likelihood resulting in a mental representation, a cleaned up copy of the world. Now, through these assumptions exists a dualism or separation of organism and environment. I don't have access to the world, only my unconscious interpretations do. That means my entire experience is based on mental representations, not the stimulation that made the representations. Leading to assumption 8. Once the copy is fixed, the representation of the world is your experience of the world. So when we put all these traditional assumptions together, assuming realism, I make a copy of the world. That copy is bad, so needs fixing. Using a series of cues and rules and likelihoods, I compute a representation. And that representation is therefore my experience of the world. But what does that computation? What does the making of the mental representations? It needs to be done by something, some entity. And the most common name in cognitive science and cognitive psychology is the central executive. Hank, in his psychology course, refers this to the little man, the brain processing, the computation. It's all the same sorts of things. It's referring to the central executive. However, the central executive is completely cut off from the world. Pretending I'm a central executive for a second, if I get a stimulation in my room, why would I assume it comes from out there? Although the third assumption suggests we start with no knowledge, the tabula rasa or blank slate, we could assume that we have at least one critical bit of information to get us started. The stimulation on our senses comes from a distant source. So as the central executive, all I need to do is figure out what the source is. When I get a retinal image from the outside, how do I know it needs fixing? How do I know the world isn't upside down 2D back to front? I can't go outside to check because I'm completely cut off from the world. I'm separate. I'm a central executive. Somehow, I need to know that the sky is up, the ground is down, and the world isn't in 2D. Next, I need rules, cues, and most likelihoods in these situations to interpret this bad retinal image that I've got. Where do the correct interpretations come from? Then, even if I do have a correct interpretation of an object, when I get a new retinal image that is different, how do I know what parts I need to focus on because they are different? An apple tree and an orange tree is going to look very, very similar. How do I know which one is which? Helmholtz attempted to get out of this puzzle by suggesting that the central executive uses the principle of maximum likelihood to interpret the stimulation when it is ambiguous, like a tally. If I get a new retinal image of a tree and it was an apple tree 3 times before and an orange tree once before, it's most likely going to be an apple tree. Modern day Bayesian modeling of perception is just a more complex version of the same idea. But if we're using a tally of sorts, there must be correct interpretations to start with. Before we can do any tally charts or Bayesian modeling, we need to know what is likely in the first place. This all suggests we must start with a lot of knowledge called a loan of intelligence. Programmers loan intelligence, information for robots and software to function to do predictions and calculations. But who loans our central executive the information? Robots also get accurate feedback from their programmers, software updates and changes so they can correct their errors in calculation. This is what is proposed to occur in connectionistic accounts of perception. But with our presumed bad senses that need to be fixed by the central executive, where do we get the correct feedback from to help the central executive correct the bad retinal image? If the central executive has accurate information of the world in the first place, why do we need to correct the bad image? Traditional approaches lead to somewhat unsolvable mysteries. The ecological approach challenges these base assumptions. Assumption 1 is pretty safe to keep, realism, the world actually exists. But assumption 2 has two parts. Empiricism, or we learn from our experiences, is a pretty safe assumption. However, the tabula rasa, or starting with no knowledge, has issues. Many assume learning starts at birth, but the existence of developing a human-shaped body in a womb is fundamentally different from the experience of developing a hawk-shaped body in an egg. Information available to the human is drastically different from the hawk. Once born, there are need-based behaviors like eating, also capabilities like a hand for grasping things. Other animals are going to have different needs and different capabilities. But these inherited constraints are different from instincts. An instinct is a fully formed behavior that is assumed to be coded somehow into the DNA of the organism. But this is, as Julia and Jeff write, unsupportable. This also means a small change in the environment could result in a species being unable to survive in the new environment, if behaviors are instinctual and coded into the DNA. A tall person will duck under a low barrier. That does not mean the ducking needs to be coded into the DNA. It could be the constraints of the body and the environment that result in ducking. Now, the ecological approach does bring different meanings to familiar words, which does add complexity when explaining this. And in this case, the space isn't always the same as environment. Here, talking about an environmental niche. An environmental niche is a specific way an organism relates to the environment it inhabits, how it survives, how it finds shelter, and so on. So the assumption of the blank slate, tabula rasa, should shift away from that blank slate. Experience begins before birth and is shaped by the constraints of the niche and the organism. Take note of the term constraint and this idea of organism-environment relationship. They'll come up a lot later. Assumption 3 was about senses informing us about the world. But the how was always in question. But there is also a hidden assumption within that the senses just drop off a stimulation and say, there you go, do something with that. But we don't just happen to be sensing things. We behave, we act in the world. So a slight shift of wording from passive to active. Organisms use their perceptual systems to inform themselves about the world. Then for assumption 4, local causality. I think it's fairly safe to say that there is multi-causality. There can be more than one cause for something. Past experiences and future possibilities also being causes for potential behavior. But instead of linear causality, point A to point B to point C, etc., the ecological approach suggests non-linear causality. So instead of thinking about a line, think about a table with 4 legs, A, B, C, and D, all supporting the behavior at the top. That removes the linear sequences of causes. But there could also be non-local causality or non-obvious causality. There were quite a few examples shared in the book, and obviously there is more in research, but one that really piqued my interest was about birds. As a bird hatches and breaks through the egg, it twists, and if it twists to the left, it determines whether it's left or right-footed. Twisting to the left determined they were left-footed, twisting to the right determined they were right-footed, and they tested this with experimental control, changing the footedness of the birds. And now that's non-linear, non-local causality. In complex systems, non-linear patterns are far more common. That means the linear causality is an oversimplification, which obviously leads to assumption 5, we make a copy of the world. And that copy is what leads to many of the unsolvable mysteries from the traditional approaches. So what if we don't need the copy? What if we perceive directly. This is one of the foundational differences of the ecological approach, which will be explored a lot later on. But this means that assumption 6, the copy is bad and needs fixing, is redundant because we don't have a copy we directly perceive. But the senses give us bad stimulations, right? Looking at the Bouchette chair illusion, traditionalists take this as evidence that the flat retinal image is interpreted via cues because the chair is specifically designed to make the cues contradict reality. But if you move slightly to the left or slightly to the right, you can see that it's not a chair. So it only works from a specific perspective, which means that when we move, the illusion is revealed as a conspiracy of geometry. And even if we do assume we have a copy of the world, it has to be completely different and unique for every situation. So we would need to preserve some variables to use for these cues, rules, and computations. Objective properties like size, depth, dimensionality, shape, they were all looked at when trying to study this. Of course, which leads to ambiguity because it depends on your perspective, so it's up for interpretation, which of course then leads to the stimulation is bad and needs to be fixed. But the ecological approach suggests, instead, we need properties that include the organism and the activity of that organism. Relational properties, not objective properties. James Gibson, a name worth remembering, suggested the stimulation is good. It's not ambiguous, provided we describe it at the level of the organism-environment relationship using relational properties. These ideas tie directly into direct perception and latter parts of this video. Assumption 7 uses unconscious inference to fix the bad copy, but if we don't have a bad copy to fix, we don't need unconscious inferences. Then assumption 8, our mental representation from the bad copy is our experience of the world, but if we don't have a copy and we don't have a mental representation, then it can't be our experience of the world, we just experience the world. However, this assumption does allude to the mind-body problem. The idea that the body is a machine of sorts and the mind is the one that operates it and controls it. But if the mind has no mass, occupies no physical space, and is completely non-physical in every way, how can it possibly affect the body? The mind sounding like the central executive here, and with no obvious solutions, the ecological approach suggests we actually need to start over. Instead of separating the senses, perceiving through our eyes, our ears, and through the skin, and that's just attached to the brain, the ecological approach looks at embodied organisms, so the eyes, the ears, the skin, all as one perceiving organism. But also it is embedded in an environment, not floating around in a void. Organisms are not just a collection of independent organs. Organisms are complex, embodied, perceiving acting systems. Think about vision. We use light to see. Light is electromagnetic radiation. It's part of the electromagnetic spectrum we can see. It is energy that radiates or emits from a source. Light emitted from the sun. Kinetic or potential energy isn't emitted, so it's a different type of energy. In visible light, the different wavelengths are the colours that we can see. But light can then be mirrored, so bounce off a surface at the same angle. 90 degrees if I look at a mirror. It could be scattered around and bouncing in lots of different directions. Maybe due to rough surfaces, or it could be absorbed and turned into, most likely, heat energy. So unstructured light from the source, like a sun, can interact with the world bouncing off, reflecting and being absorbed, so it structures the light. But we as organisms have a unique point of observation and set of action capabilities. So the stimulation encountered is not ambiguous, because the light is structured and unique, and we also have different unique points of observation. So there's not an interpretation of the stimulation, and this shifts the starting point from studying visual perception from the retinal image to the structured light. Ecology studies the relationship between animals and environments. That's where the ecological psychology comes from. So as organisms, we perceive for action. We are deliberately moving around in the world, and we can see so we don't walk into things. The traditional approaches are looking for objective properties like height, distance, or angle. That's coming from Newtonian physics and Euclidean geometry. But those properties are ambiguous, they're open to interpretation. That means movement becomes a big problem when studying visual perception. However, the ecological approach couples action with perception. Movement reveals specifying information. The unique structured light, so if I move closer to my screen, it's occluding, it's blocking off my wall in the background. My movement revealed invariance in the relationship between me and my screen. There is a special term in science to describe something that happens in the same way regardless of circumstances or contexts. A law. There was a lawfully structured pattern that emerged with my movement. Each time I move backwards and forwards, it's a unique experience, but it's lawfully structured, so the same thing's going to happen. This idea comes from James Gibson. The stimulation is not bad, not impoverished. The stimulation is good, and the stimulation is rich and unambiguous. If this is right, and the ecological approach assumes it is right, then the assumptions about computation wouldn't be needed. When talking about perception, it's traditionally been done through Newtonian physics and Euclidean mathematics. Lower order variables like wavelengths and amplitude. But we don't measure those things, there are higher order variables. The polar planimeter is a completely mechanical device, and it measures area directly. It can't measure length or width, but it can measure area. So the lower order variables, the height and width, aren't used to calculate the area. The polar planimeter directly measures area. So the next question, what are these higher order variables that we measure? The ecological approach maintains that the variables should be rooted in activity, which is what perception is for. Instead of asking, what is the length, what is the width, what is the distance, we should ask, is it reachable? Is it graspable? Gibson called these affordances. Another term worth remembering, but the medium is not the message. What we perceive is not light. It is whether the apple can be grasped. What we perceive is not sound. It is the layout of surfaces. What we perceive is not pressure on the skin or muscles. It is the usability of a tool. We don't see light as such. We see illuminated surfaces. In old cinemas or when you're using a projector, you can see the source and you can see the illuminated surface, i.e. the wall or the screen, but you can't see the light unless it's bouncing off of dust, another surface. The medium is not the message. So to contrast the 8 traditional assumptions, the ecological approach have their own assumptions. The world actually exists, so that's the same. All knowledge is gained from experience, including the experience before birth and the change in the organism-environment relationships. Organisms are active, not passive, allowing for the distinction between variance and invariance in perception, also emphasizing that perception is for action. Causality is complex and non-linear, moving away from local direct causality. The animal environment system is the fundamental unit of analysis, so the conscious mind versus unconscious mind or central executive mind versus body dualisms, they are both rejected. Instead of separating the organism and the environment or environmental niche, we keep them both together. Perception is direct, so no mental representations, like none. The animal-environment relationship lawfully structures information. We are not processing information, we are detecting information from our experiences. Variables of perception should be action-based, not physics-based. So psychology, and specifically in this case perception, shouldn't be using language from physics and mathematics, it should use its own variables, not borrowing from other science. Some call this an ecological science. Then the big assumption in the ecological approach for psychology at least, there is no central executive. This is an assumption heavily ingrained in so many areas of psychology, but if we don't need a copy of the world, we don't need to fix it, we don't need calculations and interpretations for a mental representation, we don't need a central executive. An approach like this has and can be applied to areas not just in perception, but in all areas of psychology. I was introduced to these ideas through my sports coaching degree, and it covers various elements of psychology because it focuses on human performance. But with the central executives being so ingrained, it seems very radical to say, well, we don't have one. But an explanation of something shouldn't then need an explanation. If I push my keyboard, I get a letter on my screen. The key going down caused the letter to appear. Me pushing my finger caused the letter to go down. I decided to push my finger, but did my central executive cause me to move. I've described a situation, but I've pushed back the cause all the way to the central executive. But there isn't an explanation of what caused that, yet at least. The ecological approach looks at the organism-environment relationship. The environment isn't added as a contributing factor, it is a fundamental part of the experiences of perceiving and acting and cognizing in the world. Not separated lower order variables, the macroscopic whole. As the Gestaltist psychologists pointed out, the whole is different from the sum of its parts. Just like looking at pointillistic paintings, if you're too close, you can't actually see what it is. But even with this shift in language, the dualism from Descartes goes a little bit further. This dualism proposes the body is like a machine, a metaphor that has led to loads of medical developments. But it doesn't mean the machine metaphor is correct, only that it is sometimes useful. All models are wrong, some are useful. Changing a car tire is not the same as changing a human heart. Even with extreme care, a heart can be rejected by a human. I don't think a car decides to reject a tire. So instead of a machine, a system. A system is a collection of small, simple elements performing small, simple tasks in response to local constraints and stimuli. And from this collection, sometimes incredibly elaborate and complex and non-obvious behavior will emerge. Starting metronomes at different times can become synchronized together over time. The system is self-organized, in this case, synchronized.
It's kind of magical.
The metronome system with the board and the cans all as one system can synchronize without anyone or anything touching it. For a different example of self-organization, let's take a music lesson. With a teacher at the front of the class, the students make music. Someone walking past may hear the music that they're playing. If, however, the teacher wasn't there, the students with appropriate conditions and constraints could produce the same song, the same music. That person walking past wouldn't necessarily be able to tell whether the teacher was there or not. In the book, this person walking past is called Claudia. What the ecological perspective suggests is that Claudia should consider the possibility that there is no conductor in the room, the conductor representing the central executive. But as all of these explanations are through actions, they're through processes, not things. Andrew Wilson, an ecological psychologist, wrote a blog post a while ago about verbing your nouns. The noun thing of memory, or the verb process of remembering. The noun thing of attention, or the verb process of attending. The noun thing of perception, or the verb process of perceiving. That is where the word cognizing in the book's subtitle comes from. The noun thing of cognition, or the verb process of cognizing. Yes, that's essentially thinking, but it sounds cooler when you say cognizing. So, how do we explain perception if not using the central executive? I mentioned earlier my screen is reachable or graspable. Well, when I look at my pen on my desk, I see lots of opportunities for behaviour. These opportunities for behaviour are affordances, what James Gibson was known for. This term is an invented noun form of the verb to afford, meaning to provide opportunity for. So we perceive opportunities to whether a behaviour is possible and when or how to perform said behaviour. But these are possibilities, so we're perceiving possible futures, not predicting them. When catching my pen, I'm perceiving whether, how, and when I catch it. The discussions around affordances has been going on for years in ecological psychology because that's the main scale at which we're discussing perception. At university, when I first heard about this, I thought of them as opportunities for behaviour, and luckily, Julia and Jeff say the same thing, so I don't need to do any reframing at all. Now, given the organism-environment relationship, the affordances emerge with the relationship. Take away either the organism or the environment and the affordance is no longer perceived. Now, given we are all different shapes, sizes, heights, etc., we all have different action capabilities. So an affordance for me is not necessarily the same as an affordance for anyone else, which implies we can perceive affordances for others. But it also means it relies on loads of variables within the organism-environment relationship. Just because a surface is flat doesn't mean I can walk on it. There are loads of other things I need to consider. Each one is necessary, but none of them alone is sufficient. So what does this mean? Traditionally, we would say meanings are subjective or internal. Well, in the ecological approach, meanings are neither subjective nor internal, nor are they objective or external. Rather, meanings emerge from relations between animals and environments. Sounds just like affordances. Affordances I perceive is what it means to me. Others may perceive something else, giving them a different meaning. So meanings can be perceived, not created or represented inside of us. But then how do we measure that? This is science, right? When looking at whether something is climbable, there are lots of variables as to whether you can do it or not. Bill Warren in 1984 looked at stair height and leg length to see whether something was climbable. And this specific type of climbing was climbing without assistance, so no rope. And he created a biomechanical model to predict whether people could climb on something or not, and the ratio was called critical pi. This ratio turned out to be 0.88, meaning that when the stair height is taller than 88% of a person's leg length, a person would no longer be able to climb that stair by stepping. Taller people, obviously, being able to step on taller stairs. But this ratio was a biomechanical model. To actually test this, he showed a group of tall people and small people 5 different stair heights to see if they could step on them. After randomly showing each of these people these 5 different stair heights, they had to say yes or no whether they would be able to step on it or not. And when looking at the figures, we see the taller group saying yes more, because they are taller and can step on taller stairs. But when we divide the step height by leg length, both groups become extremely similar. This means both groups, tall and small, perceive the stairs as step-onable in very similar ways. That 0.88 biomechanical model value was found in the study for both groups. First, it confirms that both leg length and stair height are important when perceiving whether something is step-onable. Organism, environment, relationship. But it also emphasizes perceivers are sensitive to the biomechanical limits on their ability to climb stairs. But every action requires effort. What about perceiving efficient climbing? Can we perceive which stairs afford the most efficient climbing? After 2 additional experiments were done, about 0.25 was the optimal pi value calculated, and for both studies, 0.25 was found. Perception of whether steps can be climbed by stepping is action scaled, so we can perceive how effortful something is going to be. But taking this even further, when we move, obviously there's dynamic constraints, we're moving around. But as the affordances we're perceiving are body and action scaled, we can adjust our behavior. Affordances are activity-specific meanings for a given animal, and a given affordance is perceived by detecting the structured energy pattern at a given point of observation that provides information about that affordance. So we perceive structured energy patterns so we can detect information about the affordances we perceive. But we have different senses, so how do we perceive affordances through these different senses? So instead of vision, we're going to talk about ecological optics. Being surrounded by energy, it allows us to perceive affordances from lots of different modes. Our eyes detecting light being pretty important. But as mentioned earlier, structured light is reflected off of surfaces, and the light will be unique, not like any other because of all the objects it's bouncing off of and reflecting through and transferring into heat in some cases. Then as I move, the point of observation changes, so of course it's going to be different. The totality of structured light at each and every possible location in the room is called the ambient, meaning surrounding, optic, meaning light, array, meaning distribution. The ambient optical array being all the light bouncing around in my room. Depth perception using traditional approaches in Newtonian physics, Euclidean geometry is looking for depth and space, which only applies with the lack of objects. But objects don't have a depth or have a space. They exist in depth and in space. Instead of looking for a lack of objects, depth perceived across space becomes how distances are perceived across surfaces. More generally, how surface layout is perceived. Looking at the chessboard straight on, they look like squares. As I tilt the chessboard away, the texture of the squares changes. When I put my hand over the chessboard, it is occluding or blocking the chessboard. There is a drop-off between surfaces. The chessboard is dropping off my hand where it is. But we are obviously moving, and through this, obviously, I've been moving, and so there's different changes going on. That is called optic flow. So the structured light reflects in ambient optical arrays, and we perceive distance in the changes in optical texture and drop-offs between surfaces, which, when we or the objects are in motion, is optic flow. When I drop my pen, the localized optic flow changes. As the pen goes down, it occludes, it blocks the stuff at the bottom, but it also reveals things at the top. There is a drop-off between surfaces. If someone throws a juggling ball at my face, the optical texture will expand simultaneously or at the same time. Now, parts of the ball will get progressively deleted as it gets closer, because now it's sort of at the back. You can see I can see there, and then as it comes closer, it goes further behind. But if the ball is missing me, then the optical flow will be different. One side is going to grow faster, asymmetrically, and there is going to be differences in the progressive deletion of whatever part of the object is going. So the part further away from me going out of view, it's getting progressively deleted. And then the closer part is obviously getting bigger because it's getting closer to me and I can see it. So I can see the left side of the ball, but not the right because it's missing to my right. Now, if I want to catch the ball, you might think, well, I need to guess. I need to calculate where it's going to be, where it's going to land. But the information is in the optic flow. The rate at which the objects are occluded. This rate is called tau. It is information about the time to arrival, assuming that current conditions continue. Optical texture of the ball is going to change slowly, but as it gets closer, it's going to speed up. If, however, I move closer towards the ball, now it's global optic flow, not localized, global, because as I move forwards, things go out of sight for me. So the rate at which the structured light on the edge of my eyes are occluding objects, that is the global rate of tau for me. As I go faster, things move past me faster, and therefore tau is larger. Now, if I want to explain catching, I could say I'm unconsciously calculating whether, when, and how to move my body. But if the information is detectable in the optic array, I don't need to do unconscious calculations. This could also explain how other animals perceive distance, rather than the human unconscious calculation via the central executive, because not all other animals or organisms will have the same computation processing power as humans. Studies on dogs, birds, and other insects, and a really interesting study on bees actually illustrates this optic flow with distance calculation, the perception of distance. For those that didn't know, bees do a little dance once they found nectar, and that signals other bees how far away the nectar is. Now, it could be done by measuring energy expenditure and some sort of calculation, or it could be done through the optic array. What they did to study this is they had bees go through two different tunnels. One of them had a black line going all the way down it, and the other one had black rings going down the tunnel. Bees going down the straight line tunnel signaled the nectar to be closer than the circle tunnel more often. Why? Flying through the ring tunnel generated more optic flow than did flying through the line tunnel. Remember, optic flow being changes in structured light patterns, suggesting more changes in optic flow increases distance perceived. Ecological acoustics is very similar, except it uses different energy. Unlike light, sound doesn't start unstructured. It doesn't come from the sun, it comes from vibrations. Each vibration structuring and changing the information. But just like light, some information will come directly from a source. Other information indirectly from other surface interaction, like walls and tables and things like that. The reflection and absorption impacted by surfaces create the lawfully structured information. As you may have been able to work out by now, the surrounding information is the ambient acoustic array. Many of the studies diving deeper into this is in the late 90s, early 2000s. One study blindfolded participants and they hit different metal-shaped rectangles with a pendulum. They were able to hear the approximate relative dimensions of each object when it was struck with the pendulum. So even though they couldn't see, they could hear the dimensions of the object. Another study looked at occluding or blocking sound. Surfaces occluding vibrations or blocking vibrations impacts the acoustic array and are therefore perceivable, hearing the object from the structured vibrations. We can also hear the difference between a breaking and bouncing sound. A 1980s study used an older version of AI to try and recreate the sounds, and we could tell the difference whether it was a breaking or a bouncing sound. Another study looked to see if we could hear if something was reachable. Again, using blindfolded participants, they tested this with a rattle box. In short, participants could hear whether an object was within reach for two different styles of reaching. So if we can hear distance, can we then hear whether we can fit through a gap or not? A study used a duck and blindfolded participants to see if we could walk between the duck call and a wall, which the participants could do. Now, with motion, tau is used. Like light, distance perceived with tau. So the distance is perceived through tau, closer objects sounding louder and clearer. But we can also hear the time it takes to fill up a glass. They could differentiate the two levels of fullness just by listening. Now, talking about hearing, echolocation sounds like something really cool. It's something bats do, but we can actually do it because it's just creating new structures in the acoustic array. One study even tested how effective we are at echolocation. They got blindfolded participants to work out how far a wall was by making a repeated noise. Their accuracy was quite a bit off, but they moved further away for the wall that was further away and closer for the wall that was closer. So human echolocation is possible. Not very accurate, but possible. And then we can't talk about acoustics without mentioning the voice. But again, like light, the medium is not the message. The sound itself is not what is perceived. The movements of the vocal tract are what is perceived by means of the sound. Vibrations being structured by all of the body parts involved in making the sound. That is why it's perceived differently between people, and obviously when we're ill. You might think that touch is different because it's physical forces, the medium being embedded in the animal or organism. But remember that understanding perception as a lawful process requires uncovering how properties of surfaces and relationships between animals and those surfaces unambiguously structure energy patterns. If I pick up an object, I'm only touching a small part of that object, but I can perceive other properties like width, length, shape, and throwability. Much like vision. We don't see entire objects, but I perceive affordances for the entire object. Instead of structured light being used, it's structured forces. Not from a point of observation, but a position or grasp of an object. There were optical and acoustic arrays. Well, what happens for the forces? Is there still an energy array? Each position in the sea has different forces, which are structured by other forces. When I pick up my pen, it feels different when it's vertical to when it's horizontal. And when I move it, I need to accelerate it. So I need to overcome the inertia or the object's resistance to stay still. That inertia, I, is an array of forces around an object. And while holding a pen, it's never truly still. It's always moving. There's always dynamic forces. But these movement corrections are happening at the same time, but in different directions. This is known as an inertia tensor. If a quantity varies in multiple ways simultaneously, like simultaneous differences in speed in different directions, or simultaneously stretching an elastic sheet in multiple directions at the same time, then you need a more complex value called a tensor. I'm not going to pretend to understand the differences between tensor and vector mathematics, but essentially they did lots of rod experiments. They got participants to pick up a rod without looking at it, and they were asked to perceive the length, the width, and the weight of the objects without looking at them. And it turns out the participants were pretty good at it. But the perceived shape wasn't the same as the actual shape. When comparing rods, we could work out what was longer or wider. So when changing the position of the weight, our perception changed. The inertia tensor creates an ellipsoid shape around the object. And they used a tensor shape to test all of this by moving it side to side, back to front, etc. As IXX increased, as the length of the ellipsoid changed, participants perceived the objects to be taller, and as IZZ increased, as the width of the ellipsoid changed, participants perceived the objects to be wider, even though the actual heights, widths, and masses of the objects were unchanged. So moving weight closer to the end made it feel longer, and moving weight to the side made it feel wider. But does that apply to our limbs? This ability is known as proprioception, which, at a glance, you would probably suggest is to do with some internal representation of where our limbs are. That must rely on a central executive or internal representations of our body. Sometimes this has been called a body schema to help us know where our limbs are. But from the ecological perspective, proprioception is also lawful. One experiment was done with these rods again, and they added weights without the participants knowing, and the participants had to note left or right where their arm was, and it matched the asymmetric weight. This pattern showed that participants were pointing with the mass distribution of the point tool and arm rather than the arm itself. So the holding of the object and the mass going either to the left or the right changed where the person felt their arm was. So it's mass orientation at a limb, not just the limb, supporting the idea of an inertial ellipsoid. And this idea can be taken even further. The touch system, including the entire body, skin, muscles, tendons. So touch is a continuous system, meaning the stimulation of relevance to perception by touch is the macro scale pattern of physical forces on the body tissue and not the microscale activity of receptor cells. Considering this when figuring out how heavy an object feels, mass obviously plays a role, right? But if the two objects have the same mass, how can one feel heavier than another? Traditional explanations would say it's something to do with the mental representation or computation your central executive's doing. From the ecological perspective, it would be the I values. I, X, X, Y, Y, Z, Z. Objects feeling harder to control will likely feel heavier. In fact, research has shown that when people report how heavy an object is, they are really reporting how movable that object is. Movable being an affordance perceived when moving an object. That is why a potato may feel heavier than a tennis racket despite having the same mass. It's the example that was used in the book. Ecological optics, ecological acoustics, ecological haptics, sight, sound, touch. But how does this work when we're perceiving for action? When it comes to movement, traditional approaches do differ a little bit, but they are built from the same assumption that our mind tells our body what to do. Our central executive gives our body commands. Our frontal lobe plans and thinks things through, those commands accounting for all of the remembered consequences. Then the motor cortex sends those signals to the body, which obviously leads us to move. My central executive needing to figure out which muscles and forces and contractions and all of the different coordinations to execute a movement, just like a wave. However, some say the commands are broad and the body specifies what movements need to be made. The commands from the central executive being like orders for the body to then follow and execute. In this case, the central executive doing the planning bit but not the executing bit. However, both these approaches require a loan of intelligence. How does the central executive know how to make a plan, monitor, manage, or know how to implement any of these before knowing beforehand? Remember, the central executive is completely isolated from the world. So where does it get its information from? If the body is implementing these programs, then where does the body get the information from in the first place? This again is using linear causality, the ABCD line, from the brain to the muscles, higher order to lower order. But as the ecological approach builds from different assumptions, these programs from the central executive are just not needed. The ecological approach seeks a lawful explanation of goal-directed action at the macro scale of the relationship between the animal and environment without the need for mediating process or loans of intelligence. Let's think about Pinocchio the puppet and the puppet master. Each joint has degrees of freedom the puppet master can control. The shoulder can go up, down, forwards, back, and rotate, so 3 degrees of freedom. The elbow has 1 degree of freedom. The forearm has 1 degree of freedom. The wrist has 2 degrees of freedom. So for the puppet master to control the puppet's movement of one arm, that's 7 degrees of freedom it needs to simultaneously coordinate. A body has between 250 to 350 joints, depending on how you're counting them, but then each muscle adds so much complexity with each different contraction it can be doing at whatever joint. So there is a huge amount of degrees of freedom just for one limb, let alone a body. That's a lot of intelligence that needs to be loaned to the central executive or the body for it to do anything. Bernstein looked at this problem and looked to try and reduce the degrees of freedom. He suggested some forces are provided for free, so without a decision. When we walk, we raise our foot, contracting muscles, but as we move forwards and put our foot down, we rely on gravity. Walking is just controlled falling. And as our body is connected, we don't need to think about keeping our body together, it moves with us. So not all degrees need to be explicitly controlled. Learning which degrees of freedom need to be explicitly controlled and which do not is part of learning how to perform a coordinated, goal-directed behavior. Beginners of movements often reduce their degrees of freedom, making movements simpler. That's why they're typically stiff and you have jittery movements because they're less skillful. As they learn the movements, they start to loosen up. But all these different movements need to work together to create the movement. Right? Well, ideas around synergy suggest components work together to achieve a goal. Slightly different, but significant. Bernstein in the 1920s and 30s did a study to have a look at movement, one specifically about blacksmith hammering. The hypothesis was that the experts would be able to produce the same movement over and over and over again. However, he found that when there was more variability in the position of the joints, there was less variability in the trajectory of the hammer. In other words, the more fluid or varied the movements were, the more accurate the hammer swings were. So it wasn't about producing the same movement, it was about achieving the same goal, hitting the hammer right. Bernstein called this repetition without repetition, a term I became very familiar with during my sports coaching degree. Yes, repetition or practice is important for developing skills, but with variation and using different behaviors. If we talk about speaking, it's actually a really complicated thing. There are lots of different moving body parts to create a sound, and researchers testing this synergy and variation of movement wanted to know what would happen if when you were talking there was an unexpected movement. So they tugged on a participant's jaw while they were saying words. On the second B, when saying bab, they tugged the jaw, but the lips compensated for the sound to still say bab. The synergy of components work together to achieve a goal, not an anatomical movement pattern. When tugging on the jaw of the Z in baz, the tongue compensated. A synergy is self-correcting and goal-preserving. The movement of coordination is self-organizing, something I will go a little bit deeper on later, but it's also the same for standing still. There are lots of muscles coordinating to prevent us from just falling over. It takes effort to stand up with a stable posture. If the floor was to move sharply, we would adjust. However, if there were subtle movements, we would likely move with the floor, say if you're on a boat. But people get motion sick, so why do they get motion sick if they're moving with the boat? Using explanations from the traditional approaches with the central executive, there might be confusions between the movements expected and planned for and the actual experience. That confusion of the central executive leading to the sickness. Or it could be due to an unstable posture. Motion sickness is more likely to occur when people stand when they sit and more likely to occur when they stand with their feet closer together than when their feet are farther apart. So anything making it harder to be stable can increase the likelihood of feeling motion sick. So motion sickness could be a movement disorder. And so this might be why when you're moving your feet apart, it can help with motion sickness because it helps the stability of your movement. So it could be about posture. But what about all of the other movements apart from posture, the suprapostural behaviours? Reaching, swinging, cooking, all of the other things that we're doing. If the central executive does need to control all of those different movements, surely adding movements, so doing more movements, would make it harder to coordinate. They tested this. To start with, participants were told to search through a text, or they were told to just look over a text while their posture was being monitored. As you might expect, looking for something reduced the postural sway over just browsing over things. But when they got people to point a laser at the wall, you might expect them to stop the postural sway to focus on the laser. But what they found was that suprapostural tasks and postural movements are cooperative, not competitive. Suprapostural tasks and postural movements don't interfere with one another. So people swaying in the study didn't impact their accuracy. Now, to be clear, this isn't like massive swaying, it's just postural sway, but instead of controlling themselves trying to be completely steady, they embraced the postural sway that they had and just pointed the laser. And then when thinking back to Bernstein's repetition without repetition, the variability can help. But obviously most movement goes beyond just postural control. Walking, running, they are different. They are completely different. The movements are completely different from one another. The ecological approach would say there is a phase transition between walking and running. Not too dissimilar from a transition from solid to liquid or liquid to gas. Ice is not the same state as water. Walking is not the same state or movement as running. And when coordinating body parts, they could be in sync or out of sync. In phase or anti-phase. Closing my hands alternatively is an anti-phase coordination. But the faster I do it, the harder it is to keep it stable. And when I start in anti-phase, as I go faster and faster and faster, I will just inevitably get to in-phase. Whereas an in-phase pattern is easy to go fast. The models behind this, explaining all of this stuff, does confuse me a little bit. I went to Berlin for a conference and they spoke about this for hours, and I could try and explain it, but I'm just going to leave it to the book. And if you do understand this stuff, leave a comment in the comment section below so I can just pin it. But now we have coordination of actions, and they could be in phase or anti-phase. But these actions and coordinations are developed over time. So developing abilities, how do we do that? A quick reminder. The traditional approach assumes local causality, indirectly perceiving using interpretations and calculations, and that's all happening in the organism, the person. And the stimulation is meaningless or ambiguous and needs fixing. Whereas the ecological approach assumes non-local, non-linear causality, directly perceiving in the organism-environment relationship, and the stimulation is lawfully structured. So developing motor skills or the ability to think, remember, or reason with the world. Let's test some babies. The visual cliff research studies are well known in the field of perception. One of the main researchers inside of this field for the cliff studies was Eleanor Gibson, and Eleanor Gibson and James Gibson were married, so you can see sort of the link there. But babies were put on a plexiglass surface with a chessboard underneath. One side was shallow and the other side was deep. Now, the older infants didn't go over the deeper side because obviously they were looking at thinking, oh no, I'm going to fall over. And that's the proof of depth perception, but as expressed earlier, that's not how ecological psychologists would explain depth. That's surface texture or the surface layout. So the ecological psychologists propose infants with more crawling experience are better able to perceive what a steep drop-off does or does not afford than are infants with less experience crawling. But as the plexiglass lets babies crawl on either side, it kind of gives up the game when the baby goes over to the other side and they know that they can crawl on it. So to test truly for affordances, there needs to be surfaces that you can fall off. I feel like I should put a disclaimer here. No babies were harmed in the making of this research, but I don't know. All I do know is that Julia and Jeff mentioned that there was a lot of baby catching in the research. So hopefully everything worked out okay. And as you would expect, the babies that had more experience were better at perceiving affordances of objects they could or could not climb up or down on. But when the babies were taken aback a couple of weeks later when they could walk, they couldn't tell what they could walk up or down on. They had to start from zero again, learning this new motor skill. Perceiving affordances for crawling didn't help them when perceiving affordances for walking. With traditional approaches, you would assume that past experiences would help them in some way with the predictions and calculations for the central executive. Maybe not that unique specific motor program, but you would imagine there's some transfer? But the babies kept falling and kept getting caught. Ecologically, we would explain this because of the change in the relationship between the organism and the environment, the baby and the objects. Different coordination patterns are now required, and obviously there is a different point of observation because now they're standing up, so they have a different point of observation for the optic array. The babies need to relearn perceiving affordances for each case. Now, when perceiving the babies that didn't crawl over the drop-offs, is that encouraging a fear of heights in any way? If the babies did learn to fear heights, surely they would have avoided the drop-offs the second time around. So the crawling, they avoid them, the walking, they still avoid them. But they didn't. It seems that rather leading to a fear of heights, crawling and walking and falling leads to learning how to perceive affordances. If you remember back to the study about the steps and the pi ratio, well, they did that study again, but with older participants. And, as you would expect, development changes over time as we age. The ratio decreasing with age. The older participants were stepping lower, which obviously makes sense. Something else to consider with age is the point of observation changes. As children grow, the point of observation increases in the short term, but also in the long term. Not just moment by moment, but day by day, week by week, month by month, and obviously year by year. And that's similar to developing different action capabilities. When babies are crawling, they are seeing more of the floor, so it's harder to see further away. But the infants can see further away, potentially why they are more interested in further away objects. However, babies need to experience these lawfully structured relationships by observing objects. They are not born with the information, they gain it through experience, empiricism, developing their sensitivity to lawful relationships and Tao. But babies close their eyes when you throw something at them. How do they know it's going to hit them? Early on, they seem to use visual angles, but as they grow, they become more sensitive to Tau and specifying variables. So acceleration is then used as they grow up. So the children, or organisms, become more sensitive to information as you develop abilities. Variability in experiences and in practice is beneficial for the learning because it exposes us to different pieces of information we can then attune our senses to and become more sensitive of. But how does that work with others? Broadly looking at traditional approaches looking to explain how people perceive and act with others, as we have internal representations of ourselves, we must have internal representations of others as well. So our central executive must have programs in some way to be able to predict how others are going to act. There is some research to support this, which is around mirror neurons. When a monkey performed a behavior and another monkey was watching, the brain activated in the same place. The observing monkey's neurons activated the same way as the acting monkey. Monkey see, monkey do. And this has been seen to some extent in humans. Seeing someone else do something stimulates our own brains as if we were doing it ourselves. In theory, now that I've seen it and I've got their program, I can now recreate and perform the same movement. I don't think that really applies to practice, but when we consider these mirror neurons, if we are mirroring what other people are doing, then we need to put effort into not doing what other people are doing. When we're sharing these programs, how do I coordinate with them not to do the same thing and do my own thing? The ecological approach just avoids this problem. Organisms detect specifying information about affordances that we are perceiving. The properties of a dog, shape, mass, strength, lawfully structure the energy patterns that I and others encounter. So, structure in patterned energy distributions provides information both about affordances for the self and about affordances for others. As mentioned earlier, coordination is about establishing and controlling the synergies, and each action is in a social context. Therefore, the coordination between me and any other object in the context. These same lawful principles that underlie perceiving and acting in animal environment systems also do so in animal-animal environment systems. This means we wouldn't need to share mental representations or transfer programs between individuals. That's not to say mirror neurons don't exist. They do. But what they do is up for debate. The brain and nervous system play a role in perceiving and acting, but in the ecological approach, it's not as significant as the traditional cognitive psychology approaches put on it. Some organisms perceive and act without a nervous system. So whatever explanation we use, we need to consider that. This is where resonance is used as a concept in the ecological approach. Like when a singer or opera singer or whoever is vibrating the glass and there is resonance between their voice vibrations and the vibrations of the glass. Resonance happens with the brain and the nervous system when we are detecting information. It is as if the animal environment system is the singer and the nervous system is the wine glass. And this is huge. Instead of going from the brain and the nervous system to action, this suggests the action within the animal environment system resonates to the brain and nervous system. So it's the other way around, not brain to action, but action to brain. Neural reuse theory suggests the brain is controlling actions by establishing brain synergies. Mirror neurons might then be a consequence of detecting the information. Different systems resonating to the same information. Now, sometimes when you're watching people, you can tell whether someone can do something or not, even if you haven't seen them do it yet. Like, I knew my mum couldn't jump over a puddle in the car park. But how did I know that? Because I hadn't seen her jump over the puddle in the car park. Well, although affordances aren't identical, they are comparable in certain ways. When I'm walking around, I perceive different points of observation, so my mum could perceive the same sorts of points of observation, but I don't experience her action capabilities. Or do I? A study looked at pairs guessing their partner's reach height and jump height. They were more accurate of themselves rather than their partners, which is somewhat expected, but they were within 8% of their partner's numbers. When they just watched their partners walk, their numbers were a little lower for the jump height. When they were walking with an ankle weight their observing partner didn't know about, the observer guessed their jump height was higher, and that actually made their guess more accurate. So watching someone walk helped them guess how high someone could jump. But they're two different activities, movements. And then adding resistance to the walking ability helped them gauge jumping. How you explain that with a central executive, I'm not really sure, because walking and jumping are different movements. They are different motor programs. If we do need a motor program or schema for walking and running, they are different. From an ecological approach, we are observing how an organism produces vertical force. And obviously that is dynamic and related to their action capabilities. To test this theory, they looked to see if someone observing twisting would help them estimate the jump height, which it didn't, which confirms that experiencing other people's action capabilities relates to perceiving affordances for others. Accuracy and how often that occurs brings expertise into the conversation. But could my past experiences also help me? I have jumped forwards a lot, and I've watched lots of other people jump forwards as well. Optical patterns that provide information of affordances should be invariant in these contexts. Watching someone jump forwards in handball is similar to watching my mum jump over the puddle, but obviously jumping straight up, not so much. And this was somewhat confirmed with studies from basketball players and non-basketball players being able to predict jump height. Basketball players were better at predicting the jump height of their partner than the reach height of their partner, because the basketball players had previous experience with vertical jumping. And if we then consider coordinating together, my mum and I walking through the doors into the shop together, we have different shoulder widths. But when we walk side by side, we consider each other's shoulder widths and we twist to get through the door. Both of us perceiving affordances for the pair. And this was not an additive property of the two of our shoulder widths, it was an emergent property between the two of us together. Both of us giving up a bit of our space so we can get through the door. Of course, some people coming through would just barge you out the way instead of twisting, but I think that's a case of manners, not perception. I say this because this was tested once again, and social bubbles were also tested. These results I'm sure you'll relate with. What they did is they had someone walk through different configurations of people. Some facing you, some facing one side, some facing opposing sides. And when participants were walking between two people and both of them were facing, then they would turn their body earlier than if they were facing away or to the sides. The participant walking was trying to avoid that personal bubble clash. And when participants were facing the same way, the person would walk slightly further away from whatever the front facing was, again, trying to avoid that personal bubble clash. And it was the same for all of the different configurations. They coordinated with the others to avoid that clash. flash. Then a different study was looking at two people sitting on rocking chairs to see if they would coordinate. When the participants looked at each other's rocking chairs, their rocking movements became unintentionally coordinated with those of the other person. They started rocking backwards and forwards together without trying. But when they couldn't see each other, there was no coordination. This syncing and coordination happens in other activities too. When walking alone, we have our own step and our own gait and move at our own distance. But when we follow someone, we coordinate, we synchronize with their steps and their gait, acting like a four-legged animal instead of two-legged animals. Right side, then left side like a giraffe or an elephant, or right, left, right like a dog or a cat in a trot. In sport, this is done through sensitivity of sport-specific affordances, coordinating movements with teammates or opponents in football, basketball, volleyball, tennis, golf, baseball, you name it, it's there. So the interpersonal and intrapersonal coordination can be explained in the same way. The coordination in each case is not that each person is getting information from shared or overlapping nervous systems, but rather that they each have the ability to detect lawfully structured, optical and mechanical energy patterns. Those thinking about educational theories about how we learn from others, if this is how we coordinate, may start to question some of the theories about shared mental models. Traditional approaches of explaining cognition rely on having and manipulating mental representations. Thinking is having and manipulating a mental representation. Learning is the modification or enrichment of mental representations. Remembering is storing and accessing mental representations. Perception as an input, action as an output. Cognition as this walled-off process from the body and environment. Cognition is described as a set of mental processes or actions that operate on or with representations and that are somehow removed from both the body and the world. This obviously therefore demands a central executive. However, the ecological approach doesn't have a central executive, so assumes that we are perceiving, acting, cognizing systems. Perception and action being coupled, not one before the other. Thinking also being embodied and embedded, so going outside of the brain and the body. Thinking happening in the organism-environment relationship. This means there is a trajectory of thinking, a continuous flow of thinking rather than dots or snapshots. One study looking at this flow of thinking asked participants to read 4 or 5 letter words until they got to 1,000 words. They were very accurate, but the researchers weren't looking at the word accuracy. They were looking at the different start times of reading out the words, 0.5 or 0.25 seconds. Now, that doesn't sound significant. It could just be background noise, and traditional research would suggest, yeah, this is just background noise. But maybe that's the hum of a perceiving, acting, cognizing system. White noise is just random moving of lengths and frequencies. It's just all over the place. Brown noise is more controlled with similar lengths of waves, but pink noise is somewhere in the middle. Pink noise tends to fluctuate, but it lingers around before moving on. And when looking at the variability of these start times, 0.5, 0.25 seconds, the variability mimicked that of pink noise. The researchers proposed that pink noise is a hallmark of a self-organizing and smooth-operating cognitive system. Okay, but what about more complex tasks? A different study used a gears problem. Participants were shown gears and they had to say what direction the last gear was going to be spinning if they were told what the first one, like the direction of the first gear. And at some point during this problem, there will be an aha moment, going from not knowing to knowing, which when thinking about perception and action would be a phase transition, walking a different state from running, knowing a different state from not knowing. Now, many participants used their hands to work out which way the gears were going to go. That was until they realised the gears alternate. Going left, then going right, going left, then going right. That realization was the aha moment. After 36 problems, the researchers found that 2/3 of the participants within the first 10 trials had this aha moment. And found the aha moment related to finger movement patterns. They found that the discovery of the alternation method by a given participant was predicted by a decrease in the stability of finger movement followed by an increase in the stability of finger movement in the trials that immediately preceded the discovery. So, thinking is embodied. But what about embedded, thinking outside of our skin? Using pink noise as a hallmark for a self-organizing, smooth-operating cognitive system, if there is an interruption in this cognitive system, the pink noise should therefore be interrupted. One study had participants play a video game and they had to move the mouse. And for 60 seconds they were moving this mouse, but for 3 seconds there was an interruption. The mouse wouldn't do what they wanted it to do. And the researchers found that when there was this glitch, this interruption with the mouse, the pink noise that was before and after this glitch turned into white noise. The brain-hand-mouse system was a self-organizing, smooth-operating cognitive system, until the mouse failed and just became an external disconnected object. But if thinking can be explained through this approach, what about learning and remembering? If perception is the detection and exploitation of information about affordances, fine-tuning those things would be learning. Education of intention. Learning what behaviours to perform, what affordances to perceive, how to explore to uncover possible information about affordances. But then also education of attention. What patterns in given structured energy arrays provide information about given affordances? The relationships between us and our environment could therefore change. But education of attention and intention doesn't necessarily mean we know how to use the information. Learning how to use the information about a given affordance to appropriately perceive a given property or perform a given behaviour is called calibration. So when we say we've learned or we've become more skilled, we could say we've become calibrated. Then when continuing this idea of thinking as this perceiving and acting continuous process, and that calibration is learning, remembering must therefore be explained in a similar way. Traditional approaches separate perception from action. You perceive, you then process or remember things, then you act. But if there is no line between perceiving and acting because they are continuous processes and they are coupled, we never stop remembering. There is no beginning or end, input, output, there is just remembering. Remembering as our awareness of perception over time. Researchers looked at remembered affordances. Remembered affordances scaled to action capabilities in the same way as perceived affordances. So thinking, learning, remembering is all continuous with perceiving and acting, verbs or processes instead of nouns, things. Now, we can and have applied ecological psychology into the world of design, designing with affordances in mind. For example, if people are driving on the road and you want them to slow down before they get to a bend so they don't go off the bend, you could put a sign there. Following traditional approaches, that should be enough. We see the sign, we process the sign and understand what it means, and then we slow down. But if we were designing with affordances in mind, instead of using the sign, we would try and provide the driver with information about affordances. Much like the bee research with the ring tunnel and the line tunnel, we can manipulate the rate of global optic flow. In this case, add lines on the road, increasing in frequency as you get closer to the curve in the road. And this was actually done in Lakeshore Drive in Chicago back in 2006, alongside various other places. But there was a 36% drop in crashes in the first 6 months. Then we've all pushed the pull door or pulled the push door, and it with the handles is just kind of annoying. But the sign, push or pull, should be enough, right? You just read the sign. If you actually read the sign and then you process it and you know what to do. It might just be me, but sometimes I read the sign, it says push, and I pull it anyway because there's a handle there. I'm like, So why not just design with affordances in mind? A flat surface for pushing and then a handle for pulling. Chair and wall designs can also afford sitting or leaning against. Surgery training devices replicating the knife interaction with the skin to help surgeons train so they don't cut too far. They're developing the feel and usability of a tool. Maybe even stair design. I remember I was on holiday in Lanzarote or one of the Spanish islands, and all the stairs were marble, white marble, but the floor was also white marble. So I'm running down the stairs and I missed the last step. I missed the last step because I couldn't see the last step. It just looked the same. There wasn't a surface texture difference enough for me to notice. This has been termed the bottom of flight illusion. But if you were to put carpets down the side or a carpet down the middle or have the floor a different color to the stairs in some way, then we're designing with affordances in mind. When affordances are hidden, it can make life difficult and sometimes just dangerous. There were some objects designed in the end of sitting artwork, and what researchers decided to do was test it. And they tested people, some in the traditional setup of just chairs, and the other one in a different room where there are more opportunities for sitting and leaning and other movement behaviors. The reasons for the research was to look at how we can get people not just sitting down all day for 8 plus however many hours, and to move into different positions. What they found was during the work, 60% of the time was reading, and 40% of the time was working, and that was in both locations, a 60-40 split. But the traditional office space with just chairs had everyone 100% sitting down whilst reading and working. There was a moment of a person standing up and working briefly standing, but then they sat back down again, so is it significant? Not really. The alternative space had 60% standing, 20% leaning, 20% squatting or lying down, and 83% of them worked in more than one position. So they moved around a lot, but work performance wasn't impacted either way, better or worse. But it was reported that the people in the alternative office environment felt more energized. That to me, I think, is pretty important, feeling energized whilst you're working, not just going to work and doing the same thing in the same posture. But we could also use ecological design with software and interfaces. There's actually a term, ecological interface design, or EID. Traditionally designed pilot interfaces, so when they're flying a plane, all those little buttons and things that they show, that had loads of information. And the pilots needed to learn what all those buttons did. They needed to store all these things in their head. They had to memorize and calculate and problem solve each time they wanted to do something. But instead of showing all the lower order variables for flying a plane, we could have ecological interface design. We could show the higher order meaningful relationships, show the information about affordances. Yes, of course, it still requires skill development to develop and exploit the information, but instead of focusing on improving the ability to form, modify, or use mental representations, training focuses on becoming attuned to which patterns, which higher order variables provide information about whether, when, and how to perform the required behaviors, and how to explore to uncover these patterns. I'm not aware of a pilot study that compares the two yet, but that's something I'm going to be looking for. And obviously there's loads of research here, but there's loads of support for this idea inside of sport and inside of the surgeon training with the knife and the skin, learning when to stop pushing the knife. Obviously they're not training on real skin, but they're learning when to stop pushing the knife, and that's time to arrival. Well, not quite the same as time to arrival, but it is tau. The more the surgeon pushes on the training device, the more resistance is added. And that is change in haptic tau, feeling how quickly the resistance increases. When non-surgeons used this training device, they actually learned how to do this pretty quickly and pretty accurately and worked out how far or how hard to push the knife. As you can imagine, when comparing them to surgeons, surgeons were better, thank God, but they still improved. And this is training with affordances in mind. Stroke patients and non-stroke patients were looked at to see whether they could walk through a gap. Those that had had a stroke before, you may think, would struggle with misperceiving affordances. That's what I thought would happen when I first saw this research, but it turns out no. Stroke patients perceived the affordances the same as non-stroke patients. It was their behaviour that was different. For stroke patients with a history of falling, it wasn't an issue of misperception or an issue of taking sufficient time. Rather, it was an issue of making effective adjustments in their movements, in particular shoulder rotations. Studies like this allow for the refinement and creation of rehabilitation programs. It can also help with training and overcoming problems as well as obviously human performance. But that was all very movement specific. But this also applies to mentally dominated skills as well. When we consider the mental side, you might think the ecological approach just rejects it and say, oh no, it doesn't exist, which some ecological psychologists do sort of, but it's not that the mental, as the word, doesn't exist. It's the assumption that the mental entities or mental processes that mediate the perceiving, acting, cognizing system. Ecologically inclined researchers still look at mental health conditions. There is research into ASD, ADHD, OCD, eating disorders, development and coordination disorders, intellectual disabilities, and the list just goes on. Current thinking uses a dynamic field of affordances with 4 different dimensions. Width, corresponding to the number of affordances to the person in that situation. Depth, corresponding to affordances that could become available if certain behaviors are performed. Remembering perception, action, cognition is this continuous process, not a snapshot. Height, corresponding to the relevance of the affordance to the person, often taking the goal into account. Then colour, corresponding to the feelings associated with the affordances, liking or disliking the behaviour. Now, this field of affordances varies in lots of different directions, but as you can imagine, with all of this varying in different ways and multi-causality, non-obvious behaviours impacting these affordances, some affordances or the field of affordances could be constrained. For example, depression may narrow affordances, making all affordances equally unattractive, reducing the width. Someone with OCD may have compulsive elements, which makes some affordances more relevant than others. So it's increasing the height of one affordance over other affordances. Those with schizophrenia sometimes say they feel like they are a spectator of their own perception, feeling disembodied, them watching themselves. But in the ecological view, the organism and the environment are intertwined, they're coupled. And if we're studying the relationship between the organism and environment, how can we study schizophrenia? Well, researchers hypothesized that those with schizophrenia would struggle to perceive affordances because affordances are the relationships between the organism and the environment. When studying this, those with schizophrenia were slower at identifying the affordances of objects, but also less accurate. But when asked to perceive color, the group with schizophrenia were still slower than the other group, but they had the same accuracy. People with schizophrenia were impaired when asked to perceive affordances, which requires perceiving the self in relation to the environment, but not when asked to perceive physical or geometric properties, which requires perceiving only the environment. And of course, this impacts the entire field of affordances, height, width, depth, and color. When thinking about communication, the synchronizing or coordinating with others, researchers did that chair syncing again when they were rocking chairs back and forth, but they did this with children with ASD. And they found those with ASD are less likely to unintentionally synchronize their movements. Researchers concluded that difficulty perceiving and acting with respect to the rhythms of the world and of other people is an important prerequisite for social connection, and that impairment in this ability may play a role in ASD. So the variations we see in humans can be found through ecologically driven research. Disabilities, disorders, injuries, impairments, all of them can be described and explained through ecological research and approaches, which means we could and potentially should be using ecological research to design the training, the rehabilitation, and the practice. You will have or will likely know someone that has been to physio, and you've probably seen them recommend doing the same movement over and over and over again. You get this big program, do 3 sets of 10 reps of this leg movement, and that'll help you do day-to-day movements. But it doesn't tend to work like that. Sometimes you can do the daily activities before you've done the program, before you finish the program, but other times you can't do the daily activities after you've done the program. Sometimes you may even injure yourself when you go to do daily activities because the program, for whatever reason, hasn't worked. And ecologically, we would explain that because the skills, the movements you're doing are different. The organism, person, environment, relationship. The practice, whatever rehabilitation training is, should represent the performance, should represent the movements. Physio rehabilitation should be activity-based not movement-based. So instead of doing knee flexion and extension, sit down, stand up. Now, as mentioned throughout this video, complex dynamic systems, us, are non-linear. That's where this multi-causality and non-obvious causality can come into some of these explanations. And at the center of all of that is complexity. Complexity is a function of the number of and interactions among the factors that affect a particular outcome. All of these interactions resulting in emergent behaviors, not predictable, emergent. Ecological psychology relies on what's called dynamical systems theory to help explain a lot of these interactions. At uni we did this in a group, but I'm going to have to do it by myself. I have a sheet, and as I move you can see the ball obviously moves with sheet. The ball is attracted to the bit at the bottom, gravity. In dynamical systems theory, this sheet is called an attractor layout or attractor landscape. And as I stretch it out, the attractor down the bottom, so the dip where the ball is shallow, but as I move it closer, the dip, the attractor, is deeper. And the deeper the attractor, the more stable it is. So I'm not really going to move the ball like this. But there is never just one behavior. So there's never just one attractor. There are more opportunities for behavior. Now, I'm not going to try and move these around because they'll just all fall off. But it means there's multiple attractors or multiple dips in that attractor layout, the sheet. But there are different types of attractors. There is a fixed attractor that just stays in the same place. So the dip in the sheet would stay there even if the ball behavior moved somewhere else. There are periodic attractors, so they go between one another like a pendulum going from side to side. It attracts side to side. But these periodic attractors could also be repeated with some differences. Quasi-periodic, like the life of a leaf. It goes through different stages, but it can go through at different rates and different times throughout the year. Then there are chaotic attractors, not random, chaotic. Veritasium did a video about this a while ago, so I'm going to share that clip and hopefully it gives some more context.
We can pick any point as our initial state and watch how it evolves. Does our point move toward a fixed attractor or a repeating loop? It doesn't seem to. In truth, our system will never revisit the same exact state again. Here, I actually started with 3 closely spaced initial states, and they've been evolving together so far, but now they're starting to diverge. From being arbitrarily close together, they end up on totally different trajectories. This is sensitive dependence on initial conditions in action. Now, I should point out that there is nothing random at all about this system of equations. It's completely deterministic, just like the pendulum. So if you could input exactly the same initial conditions, you would get exactly the same result. The problem is, unlike the pendulum, this system is chaotic. So any difference in initial conditions, no matter how tiny, will be amplified to a totally different final state.
So, attractors can be difficult to isolate. The opposite of the attractor, the drop in the sheet, is where my hands are, the repellers. Somewhat aptly named, if you ask me. But now we can explain behavior through dynamical systems, not behavior as this static thing that happened. So these attractor layouts change over time. When thinking about the phase states of walking and running, as we speed up, the attractor layout changes. So it may be attracting to walking here, we speed up and it changes, and then the behavior attracts over to running, and that's because of the speed that we've increased the behavior with. Once that speed increases to a point, there will be a phase transition between walking and running, the 2 different attractors. And in this case, the running, when you get to a certain point, will be more efficient than walking, which is what the system wants to do. It wants to do efficient behaviors. When testing these attractor behaviors, one study looked at juggling. After observing a professional juggler, the researchers realized some of the attractors in this cascade pattern that they were making. The balls were carried 70% of the time, but in the air 30% of the time. When these new participants were taught to juggle, this number was 60%, 80%. It was kind of all over the place. But this testing and practicing of juggling could be described as exploring the attractor landscape. Over time, participants learned to juggle, yes, at different rates, but they all attracted to this 70%. The juggling behavior wasn't as stable as the professional, but that comes with calibration over time of education of attention and intention. But attractors could also be social norms, interactions between people, you leaning one way more than the other. Or they could be from physical orientations of objects. Finding the quickest route from your table in the classroom to the door, you just go in the same route because it's the one you're used to. It's an attracted route. Learning is therefore about developing skills, and adaptation is developing those skills for the new context. But the noise, the surrounding noise, is an integral part of the system. Now, a behavior isn't going to attract to a repeller, that's kind of the point of the name, repels, but as I shake things around, it will get closer and closer to the attractor. That shaking, that noise is helping the transition. If we think about that gear problem I mentioned earlier, where they had to solve where the gears were going, the rotations of the gears, and if we to add noise, so say shake the gears around, in theory, that should help them get to the alternative method faster. The more noise that was introduced to the system, the more the gears hopped around the screen, the more likely it was that the participants discovered the alternation method. So as mentioned earlier with the postures and the lasers, removing the noise can actually hinder someone's ability to develop skills, because the noise is an integral part of the system. Now, we could have things start at different places but end at the same place. Equifinality. Something like language. People born all over the world with vastly different situations. Let's just take some people in a country. They're still born in different houses, states, situations, but they will still find a way to communicate, even if it is sign language. This is something I mentioned when I was discussing cognitive load theory in a recent video. On the other hand, we could start at the same place, but end in two completely different places. Pluripotentiality. Twins start at the same place, but can end in drastically different places, similar to siblings. But how do we then measure dynamic systems? It's not one moment in time that we're looking to measure, it's continuous measurements. Eye tracking, motion tracking, even remote tracking, like using the old Nintendo Wii. But once we have all that data, instead of looking for the average, a proposed point in time, we would look for the fluctuations. Julia and Jeff use an example in the book where someone hates and loves their job at different times. An average value would find a neutral zone, but they were never really neutral about their work. They either love it or they hate it. And the way this is looked at is through recurrence quantification analysis. And again, I'm not going to pretend to understand what it is, I just know how the results look. One study looked at the A not B error. And this is traditionally put down to object permanence. People not realizing objects still exist when you cover them up. But this can also be extended to you having a habit. So say going to a drawer that you're used to something being in, even though you know it's not there anymore. You know it isn't there, but you go there, you make the error because you're so used to doing it. Object permanence obviously struggles to explain this situation. It can explain why objects stay the same when you cover them up, but not this habitual confusion of behavior, like it was there but it's not there because I just forgot. Dynamical systems can explain this. Constraints shifted the attractor layout, which accounts for the delay in new behaviors. It takes time for the new behavior to attune to the new attractors, to stabilize in the attractors. There needs to be noise, time for the behavior to attract down that little dip. And those constraints are obviously going to differ for each individual depending on their field of affordances. Reading comprehension, explained through ecological dynamics, also uses the recurrence analysis. A study looking into this found that the comprehension of text had higher recurrence levels of information. Less apt readers explored the space but were unable to find areas of recurring content. This gives us ideas about how we can help people develop those skills. In this case, finding the attractor, which was the recurring themes across the texts. But dynamical systems don't stop there. Interactable conflict is conflict where the agents involved just can't get over the differences. War being one example. Most people involved in war will want to stop people dying, stop the number of deaths, but war still continues. The attractors of war are deeper than the attractors of peace. not death. When in a state or behaviors of peace, obviously it's the other way around, peace being deeper than war. So when navigating conflict using these dynamical systems, we don't necessarily want to change the attractors, but what we do want to do potentially is destabilize the attractor layout. Just like when trying to synchronize asynchronized or out of sync movements, the change of speed destabilized the attractor layout and therefore resulted in a phase transition of behavior from walking to running or from war to peace. The speed in this example is the destabilizer. So changing a control parameter like speed can destabilize the layout. If you could discover a control parameter for a particular relationship, then provide a more stable arrangement while the system is destabilized, it might be possible to create new, lasting patterns for behavior. Now, that's pretty cool if you ask me. Now, I haven't applied this in war, but I do apply this situation in all of the arguments, discussions, conversations I have with other individuals. But if we actually zoom out a bit, we can go even further and we could start talking about evolution. Changes in species is often associated with Darwin's theory of evolution, but also combined with natural selection. This combination of evolution and natural selection often refers to neo-Darwinian or modern evolution synthesis. You're either thinking about or have probably heard the term survival of the fittest. The dominant behaviors related to the idea that the fitter you are, the more likely you are to survive, but what does fit mean? When I learned about this at school, this is pretty much all I can remember. The animals that survived the problems from the environment, those were just passed on through the genes and they were the behaviors that carried on. The animals solved the problems in the environment with variations of behavior, and via natural selection, those variations were just passed down through genes. The animals with better genes will therefore survive, so the dominant genes will keep going, but the recessive or less dominant genes would disappear, die out. But some variations in species can be so diverse that the species actually separate and become different species. And the name for that is speciation. However, if there is an environmental problem that can't be solved quick enough by evolution, then the species goes extinct. But heritance isn't just DNA. Actions and environments could alter DNA, which changes how things are passed on. This traditional approach to evolution is about the individual, one animal beating or outlasting the other animal. But that doesn't account for altruism. Why would one animal want to save another animal? That's saving the species, not the individual. So we need to step back a bit. I don't think there is a gene for altruism, and Julia and Jeff didn't mention one in the book. So this trait, this altruism trait, is incidental. It happens because of something else. That doesn't quite match my original idea about survival of the fittest. It's not quite neo-Darwinian. If you think about red blood cells, they carry oxygenated blood around the body. That keeps us fit, it keeps us alive. But it's the oxygen that does that, not the red bit. Octopus or octopi have blue blood, so it does essentially the same thing, except it's blue, not red. Carrying oxygenated blood is the trait. The red colour is incidental. Julia and Jeff in the book call this a gift with purchase. You buy one, you get something else for free. You evolve oxygenated blood transfer, you get the red bit for free. So as a species, we evolve to survive as a species, and altruism comes for free. If you're like me, you might wonder what the Darwinians mean by environment. As mentioned earlier, environment, space, environmental niche are all slightly different. If species interact with an environment, it's an environmental niche. And that's different from other environmental niches. We can't fly, so we're in a different environmental niche to birds. I know, a very broad example, but hopefully you get the point. So the environment problem the organism, animal, person needs to solve, surely that should be specific to the environmental niche of the species. Unless ecologists want to correct me in the comments, a environmental niche needs a species. But this means a niche could be anything, really. So if evolution is problem in environment, it kind of loses some of its explanatory power because it's not environment, it's environmental niche, much more specific. And the neo-Darwinian approach also seems to rely on the environment staying pretty much the same. It's the animals that evolve to survive in the environment. But environmental niches are constantly changing. Obviously, the climate crisis is one example, but when you have beavers making things, making dams, that's known as niche construction, a species changing or constructing elements of the niche. So this natural selection and evolution can't solely be based on DNA, and it can't solely be dependent on the organism. If it was, you would think that the species that's been around the longest would be the most adapted, most fit species to stay around, but it seems that species length is independent on the time at which that they have been in existence. The start of a species is also a big, somewhat unanswered question. That doesn't mean the model is wrong, just incomplete. As I imagine you could grasp by now, the ecological view looks at the organism-environment relationship. That's the scale they're looking at, not the organism. But this then requires a theory of explanation similar to Gibson's theory of direct perception. But we need a lawful theory or explanation of evolution. The Red Queen hypothesis attempts to combine organism-environment. In this view, niches are gradually but continuously changing, and species are gradually but continuously running along behind. Now, although this sounds more ecological, it's still not truly ecological because organism and environment are still separate. Ecological here, I'm referring to ecological psychology. It also doesn't explain why a species can evolve when all the other species are keeping up. Why would warm-blooded creatures evolve when cold-blooded were doing just fine? Why did birds evolve when land animals were doing just fine? Why evolve animals that eat plants when plants are doing just fine? These theories can explain why species survive, but not explain how they get there. The beginning of life. Not a question I imagine you'd think that would be coming up in this video. In ecological psychology and much of the biology research, from what I can see, they use the theory of thermodynamics, the study of energy, to explain these things. That being evolution and or speciation. And thermodynamics, like direct perception, is built on laws. Physicists, again, correct me in the comments if I'm wrong, but one of the laws can be broken down into two sort of parts. All energy is treated the same, be it heat, mechanical, electrical, it's all the same. Energy. It can be moved or converted, but not created or destroyed. This means if we're trying to look for energy in systems, we need to zoom out because the energy may have moved somewhere else. A second law in thermodynamics is about entropy. As I understand it, and as it is explained in the book, entropy is about splodges, or clumps of sand. The dissipation of energy. When dots or sand are spread out across a screen, that is thermodynamic equilibrium. There is equal distance between all of the dots. If the dots go together, you then get clumps or splodges. The clumps, known as potential energy, can do mechanical work. As energy moves from clumps, it can cause a change. Evenly distributed energy, dots, sand, can't move from a clump because it's not in a clump. Entropy is the measure of how much energy in a system is unavailable for mechanical work. Or you could say a measure of disorder in a system, how spread out things are. Clumpy energy is ordered like us, but spread out energy is disordered. Thermodynamic equilibrium is maximally evenly distributed energy, so maximum entropy. There is maximum disorder. The law states that these ordered, clumpy, low entropy systems are not stable. They want to be more evenly distributed. They want to have higher entropy, be more spread out, be more disordered. So if we think of things like humans, batteries, plants, we are energy sinks. We're clumping energy together. We are ordered and we have low energy, so energy is sinking into us, hence the energy sink. And if we think about evolution, it's creating energy sinks, it's creating species. But doesn't the trapping of energy, the creation of energy sinks through evolution, doesn't that go against the entropy slope? That's known as negentropy, and this would be a problem as it goes against the law of equilibrium, thermodynamic equilibrium. However, remember, as we're stepping back looking at where the energy is moving, bigger organisms expend more energy, so we could actually increase entropy and disorder and do it quicker. So zooming out, looking at the whole energy systems, this thermodynamic approach looks at the end state, not the current state of the animal, the end state of equilibrium. If you have managed to put all the pieces together or seen content about this before, the thermodynamic equilibrium would be the end of the universe. What an uplifting video. But we're well away from that, so don't worry about it. But if we do come backwards a little bit back to evolution, this dissipation of energy explains the survival part of evolution, because obviously we want to keep the animals together so we can create entropy, and it would also explain the procreation parts, because obviously we want more animals, more energy sinks. But this thermodynamic approach also explains why species evolve, why there is speciation. Why did land animals evolve when aqua animals were doing just fine? They evolved because there was lots of energy available to be consumed. This could also explain the variety of life. Each new form of life has a new energy sink. If there is an energy source that isn't being consumed, say plastic, because it isn't biodegradable, a term used where a species doesn't consume the source, then we could predict a species to evolve that consumes plastic. A plastic-eating species. Skeptical? Well, say hello to the plastic-eating waxworms, or the plastic-eating fungus, or the plastic-eating microorganisms. There aren't enough of these species to solve the plastic problem we have in the world, but the thermodynamic approach does explain why these species evolved. And using this approach, life was inevitable. Now, life, as mentioned earlier, has organization, and it could be organized through self-organization or through other organization, something like a central executive. Using other organization is like following a blueprint or a plan. But obviously there's lots of intelligence needed at the start to create the blueprint or plan. And the ecological approach doesn't say that doesn't exist, it does, and that there can also be partial self-organization. But the bulk of biological systems that are evolving and that do evolve in the natural world are self-organized. And self-organized systems don't require a lot of upfront intelligence to perform. They don't need loans of intelligence. A self-organized system is one in which small, minimally intelligent pieces follow local, simple rules by constantly interacting with each other. And sometimes, very complex behaviors and complex patterns can emerge, and direct systems can respond to perturbations or interruptions. Dynamic systems have attractor states, so stable behaviors. But dynamic systems also have multi-stability, more than one possible stable state. This can account for the various attractors in an attractor layout, but also explain why there is more than one attractor in a situation or attractor layout. Water spinning clockwise or anti-clockwise, two different attractors, multi-stability as long as there's no influences. One example is where groundspeople just lay a huge sheet of grass going in between all of the buildings, and the self-organization of the individuals just going from A to B will show that the paths emerge from all of the movements. Some people, obviously to start with, will go all over the place, but then you will get converging paths into what the groundspeople will eventually turn into solid paths. And ants do the same thing when finding food. Ants have a good sense of where home is. They know how to get back to wherever they come from. So what they do is they lay chemical scents and pheromones to other ants for them to follow. And forager ants leave more pheromones when they found food that's high in calories. So when ants do find the food, ants are just following the pheromones and then on their way back, because they want to get back as quickly as possible. If they go back in a path and it's going off to the left when it should have gone forwards or something, they'll go back on themselves, which obviously removes the pheromone track, and then they'll go back to the shortest route. Eventually, through self-organization and all the ants following the shortest route, you will get a path to food and path to other food. Another example is the syncing of fireflies blinking. Explaining this through other organized systems, you may say there is a conductor or a trigger point which starts them all off blinking at the same time. But through the research, there doesn't seem to be a conductor or a trigger point because the fireflies can't see each other and there's loads of other things that get in the way. It seems to be local forces. The entire hillside can flash in sync just by individual fireflies synchronizing with their neighbors. Termite buildings, bees finding nectar, wasp huts, they're all different examples, and there's loads more in the book. But if we move away from animals, we see self-organization in other things like metal beads. In this image, electricity wants to get to the surrounding ring as quickly as possible. It wants to dissipate the energy, as in thermodynamics, it wants to follow the entropy slope. With oil in the dish, when we put electricity into the dish, all the beads will snap together into a line to form from where the electricity goes in so it can get out. The beads followed the laws of physics, not a conductor of sorts. And again, there are loads of other examples of this in the book, but it emphasizes the body as a system, not a machine. When we look at body temperature, some explanations may say it's to do with a thermostat in the brain. The brain then conducting or triggering the sweating or shivering responses. But that explanation of other organization doesn't explain the data. The body temperature fluctuates throughout the day like a dynamic system. A fever makes our body temperature go all over the place. This thermostat doesn't keep us to an optimum temperature level. Either the thermostat is being played with by the central executive by who knows what, or there is another explanation. The body temperature could be an emergent property from the coordination of the body's systems. The digestive system, circulatory system, nervous system, endocrine system, etc. This could be described as a tug of war. One system wanting hotter while another system wanting colder. Both of them coordinating for the goals of the system. Our immune system wants to bring up the temperature so it can fight the fever off. But maybe other systems want it to be colder so it can actually function and do what the system is meant to do. The DNA in this case could be setting up rules for self-organizing systems to follow, but they follow them in line with the laws of physics in the changing contexts. So the DNA isn't a blueprint or plan to follow, it just sets out some guidelines for self-organization to work towards. Bit of a sideways analogy here, but it's kind of like building an F1 car. All of the teams have the rules set out, and they all end up building a car, but the self-organization of the members of the team do all of their own things, autonomy, etc., to get to the end goal of F1 car that's fast. Now, ecological dynamics, the thing I started with at the very beginning of this video, combines ecological psychology and dynamical systems theory as a framework, so it encompasses all of these ideas. So my language, when talking about my experiences and learning, uses things like attractors and affordances, constraints, and then the development of skills, not acquisition. I'm looking at developing my skills over time through the organism-environment relationship to solve the problems I have in the environmental niche that I'm in. So my brain isn't the problem. My naturally limited central executive isn't the problem because I don't have a central executive. My calibration of capabilities, attention and intention, or my increase of level of expertise in that specific context needs developing to achieve the goal-directed behavior. Instead of following instructions to find the right answer or repeating the same thing over and over and over again, I design the environment with affordances in mind. Ideas and concepts like nonlinear pedagogy, the constraints-led approach to coaching, or in this case, learning. Then you've got repetition without repetition, representative practice design, periodization, the list goes on. I have sporadically discussed these ideas in a weekly podcast I do with a podcast co-host, John, but as annoying as it is to say, it depends. It depends on the relationship you have with the environment. So there is no how to do ecological dynamics. There's no step-by-step instruction of how to apply these things. There are some guidelines and some ideas and rules, but there's no set way to do it. For me, ecological dynamics gives me a way to explain my experiences that actually match the experiences I have, but it also lets me shape the experiences I have for better learning and developing of skills and expertise in whatever skill it is that I'm trying to develop at the time. I will be making more videos on putting this theory into practice and showing you some examples of how I'm putting it into practice on this channel, but also looking at alternative ideas because, like I say, this isn't a solution, they are ideas. So looking at ideas like the Bayesian brain hypothesis is really interesting for some of the research findings they've found. I may not explain the results the same way, but the results are still useful nonetheless. This is an ongoing practice or process of thinking after all. So if that sounds interesting, and if you've watched this far, I assume that's sort of interesting, consider subscribing and keep an eye out for future videos.